The silence in the dining hall of Blackwood Manor was a physical entity, as thick and suffocating as the velvet draperies that choked the light from the tall, arched windows. It was a silence curated over generations, polished to a high sheen like the mahogany table that stretched between them, a vast, dark ocean, separating two lonely islands. On one shore sat Alistair Beaumont, the 8th Duke of Blackwood, a man carved from the same cold granite as his ancestors, whose portraits stared down from the walls with judgmental, oil-painted eyes. On the other sat his wife, Eleanor, a duchess in name but a prisoner in practice, her presence in the room as ornamental and as overlooked as the porcelain shepherdess on the mantelpiece. Alistair raised his wine glass, the crystal catching the candlelight in a brief, blood-red flare. His movements were economical, precise, devoid of any wasted energy. He did not look at her. He rarely did any more. His gaze was fixed on the space just beyond her shoulder, as if she were a ghost he was attempting to ignore. The air was heavy with the cloying scent of beeswax and roasted pheasant, a funereal perfume that seemed to seep into the very fabric of Eleanor's silk gown. She felt the weight of it, the weight of the silence, the weight of the centuries of Beaumonts pressing down on her, demanding an air, a duty, a conformity she could no longer pretend to possess. Beside Alistair sat his uncle, Lord Frederick Beaumont, a man whose smiles never quite reached his eyes. His face was a carefully constructed mask of avuncular concern, but beneath it, Eleanor had long sensed something grasping and cold. He was the spare, the shadow, the man who would have been Duke had Alistair's father not produced a son, and he never let anyone forget it. "The tenants in the West Riding are complaining about the damp again, Alistair," Frederick said, his voice a smooth, cultured purr that slid into the silence like a well-oiled blade. "You must be firm. Give them an inch, and they will take a mile. Your father understood that." Alistair nodded, his jaw tight. "I will have my man of business look into it." He did not say our man of business. It was always his house, his title, his problems. She was merely a guest here, a temporary fixture in the grand, cold tableau of his life. Eleanor pressed her hand to her lower abdomen, a gesture so subtle it was lost in the folds of her gown. A secret fluttered there, a tiny, insistent life that was hers and hers alone for now. She had tried to tell him twice. The first time, he had been engrossed in ledgers, waving a dismissive hand without looking up. The second time, Frederick had been with him, and the words had turned to ash in her mouth. The uncle's presence was a constant, a creeping ivy that was slowly strangling what little air remained in their marriage. "The Duchess is quiet this evening," Frederick observed, turning his cool gray eyes upon her. It was not a question, but an accusation. "Are you feeling quite well, my dear? You have seemed delicate of late." The word hung in the air. Delicate. It meant weak. It meant unproductive. It meant failing in her primary duty. Eleanor felt a familiar chill, the cold dread of his insinuation. She forced a smile that felt brittle, fragile enough to shatter. "I am perfectly well, thank you, Lord Frederick." "Of course," he murmured, dabbing his lips with a linen napkin. "It is merely the strain of the season, no doubt. Such a tiresome parade of faces." He looked at Alistair. "A legacy is not built on social niceties. It is built on strength, on blood." Alistair's gaze flickered towards Eleanor then, just for a moment. It was unreadable, a shuttered window to a house she was not permitted to enter. Did he see her? Did he see the woman he had married, the woman who had loved him with a fierce, hopeful heart? Or did he only see the barren duchess his uncle so subtly painted her to be? The hope that had once burned so brightly within her had dwindled to a tiny, stubborn ember, and she shielded it with all her might against the cold draughts of this house. She knew she had to tell him about the child soon. The secret was a growing weight, a truth that would change everything. But she was afraid. She was not afraid of Alistair's anger. He was rarely angry. Anger was a hot, passionate emotion. and her husband was a creature of ice and control. She was afraid of his indifference. She was afraid he would look at this miracle, this tiny, fluttering life, and see only an inconvenience, another line item in the grand, burdensome ledger of his dukedom. She was afraid his uncle's poison had already done its work, turning his heart against her so completely that not even the news of his own child could find purchase there. Later that night, the manor settled into a profound, echoing quiet. Eleanor lay in her vast, cold bed, the space beside her empty and undisturbed. Alistair slept in his own chambers, as he had for the past year. It was another wall between them, another ocean to cross. The moon cast a pale, skeletal light through the window, tracing the patterns of the brocade curtains on the floor. She watched the light, listening to the ancient house groan and settle around her. It did not feel like a home. It felt like a mausoleum, and she was just another one of its ghosts, waiting for her time to fade completely. But now something was different. The tiny life inside her was an anchor, a promise. It was not a Beaumont legacy. It was her child, and for that child, she would find the strength to fight the silence, to fight the cold, to fight the creeping shadow of Lord Frederick. For that child, she would learn to roar. A week bled into another, each day a meticulous replica of the one before. Breakfast in silence, a solitary walk through the manicured, soulless gardens, an afternoon of pointless needlework, her stitches as tight and constrained as her life. The pregnancy was a burgeoning secret, a warmth that radiated through her, a stark contrast to the glacial chill of her marriage. She felt a fierce, primal protectiveness that was entirely new. This child was not an heir to be paraded and judged. This child was a part of her, a reason to endure. She decided, with a resolve that surprised her, that she would tell Alistair that evening. She would not be cowed by his uncle or by her own fear. She would go to his study, lock the door behind her, and force him to see her, to hear her. She dressed with care, choosing a gown of deep emerald velvet that made her feel less like a ghost and more like a queen. She practiced the words in her mind as she walked the long, portrait-lined corridor to his study. The faces of his ancestors watched her pass, their expressions ranging from haughty disdain to stern indifference. They were a dynasty of stone, and she had dared to bring a fragile, human heart into their fortress. The door to his study was slightly ajar. She heard voices from within, Alistair's low baritone and Frederick's smoother, more insidious tone. Her hand froze on the doorknob. She should not listen, she knew. It was dishonorable. But a cold knot of dread in her stomach told her this was no ordinary conversation about tenant farmers or crop yields. "And you are certain of this?" Alistair's voice was strained, tight, like a wire stretched to its breaking point. "My dear boy, do you think I would bring you such a devastating truth if I were not?" Frederick's voice was a study in feigned sympathy. "I have the letters. I have the sworn testimony of the stable boy she met in the woods. I paid him for his silence, of course, to protect the family name. But my loyalty is to you, Alistair, to the future of this dukedom." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Letters? A stable boy? The accusations were so ludicrous, so utterly baseless, that she might have laughed were it not for the chilling conviction in Frederick's voice and the horrifying silence that followed from her husband. "She has seemed distant," Alistair said, his voice barely a whisper. It was the sound of a man grasping for any explanation that did not involve his own failure. "Distant? She has been deceitful." Frederick pressed his advantage. "And now, this supposed pregnancy. Think, Alistair. After all this time, suddenly, she is with child? It is a desperate, pathetic attempt to secure her position, to pass off another man's bastard as a Beaumont." The word struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. Bastard. The sound seemed to echo in the hallway, ricocheting off the cold stone walls and lodging like a shard of glass in her heart. She pushed the door open. The two men turned, their faces caught in the lamplight. Alistair's was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something she could not name. Frederick's expression was one of triumph, barely masked by a flicker of surprise. "Eleanor," Alistair breathed, taking a step forward. She ignored him, her gaze fixed on the letters scattered across his desk. Her name was written on one in a crude, unfamiliar hand. Forgeries. Obvious, clumsy forgeries. But he had believed them. He had looked at this transparent lie and chosen to believe it over her. "You would believe this?" she asked, her voice preternaturally calm. The shock was so profound it had frozen her, encasing her in a shell of ice. There was no room for tears or hysterics. There was only a vast, hollow emptiness where her love for him had been. "You would believe the word of him over your own wife?" Alistair looked from her to his uncle, his face a mask of confusion and pain. He was a man caught in a trap he had helped set. "Frederick has proof, Eleanor. He has witnesses." "He has lies," she stated, the words flat and dead. She looked at her husband, truly looked at him, and saw not the man she had married, but a stranger, a weak, pliable man who had allowed his heart to be poisoned by a viper he called family. "I came here tonight to tell you that I am carrying your child, our child." Frederick scoffed, a short, ugly sound. A touching performance. Eleanor's gaze snapped to him, and for the first time, he saw the steel beneath her quiet exterior. "You are a parasite, Lord Frederick. You have fed on this family's insecurities for years, and you will choke on your own ambition." She turned back to Alistair, her heart pleading with him one last time. "See me. Believe me." But his eyes were clouded with doubt, his trust in her shattered by his uncle's patient, meticulous campaign of lies. "The child is not mine," he said. The words were quiet, but they detonated in the silent room, annihilating everything. He did not shout. He did not rage. He delivered the sentence with the cold, detached finality of a judge. And in that moment, Eleanor knew it was over. Not just her marriage, but her life as she knew it. The ice around her heart cracked, not to release a flood of sorrow, but a wave of cold, clear, liberating certainty. She would not stay here to be broken. She would not allow her child to be born into a house where its own father denied its existence. She turned without another word and walked out of the study, leaving the two men in the lamplight with their victory. The walk back to her chambers was the longest of her life. The ancestral portraits seemed to sneer at her now, their painted lips twisted in silent mockery. She was the outsider, the fraud, the failed duchess. But as she closed the door to her rooms, she felt a strange sense of peace descend. The gilded cage was no longer a prison. It was simply a place she was leaving. That night, Eleanor did not weep. Tears were a luxury she could not afford. Instead, she moved with a quiet, methodical purpose that felt alien, and yet deeply familiar, as if she were finally waking from a long and troubled sleep. She opened her armoire, pushing past the rustling silks and heavy velvets, the uniforms of a life that was no longer hers. At the very back, tucked away in a small wooden chest, were the clothes she had arrived with: a simple wool traveling dress, sturdy boots, a plain cloak. They were the garments of a gentlewoman of modest means, not a duchess. They were the clothes of Eleanor Croft, her maiden name. She stripped off the emerald velvet gown and let it fall to the floor in a shimmering heap, a snakeskin she was shedding. Dressed in the simple wool, she felt lighter, more herself than she had in years. She went to her jewelry box, a magnificent creation of inlaid rosewood and mother of pearl, a wedding gift from Alistair. She opened it. The diamonds and pearls and sapphires glittered coldly in the moonlight, a king's ransom. They were shackles, each one a link in the chain that bound her to this house and this title. She closed the lid. She would take none of them. She did, however, take the small purse of household money she kept in her writing desk. It was not a fortune, but it was enough. Enough to buy a ticket on a coach, enough for a room at an inn, enough to start again, somewhere far from here. She moved through the room, a ghost collecting the last vestiges of her former life. She took a small, leather-bound book of poetry her mother had given her, and a single silver locket that held a miniature portrait of her father. She paused, her fingers tracing the cool metal. On an impulse she could not explain, she opened the locket's other side, the side that held a miniature of Alistair, painted when they were first engaged. His painted eyes were full of a cool confidence, the same look he had worn as he denied their child. With a steady hand, she left it. She would carry no image of him with her. Her final act was to write a note, not to Alistair, there was nothing left to say to him, but to her lady's maid Clara, a kind girl who had shown her more genuine warmth than anyone else in this house. The note was simple. It explained that she was leaving, that Clara should take any of the gowns or jewels she wished as severance, and that she should not be blamed. Eleanor left it on her pillow, a small white flag of surrender that was, in reality, a declaration of independence. Her hand rested one last time on the gentle swell of her belly. "It is just us now," she whispered into the silent room, "and I will keep you safe, I promise." Slipping out of the manor was surprisingly easy. The house was built on formality and routine, and it had no defenses against the unexpected. A servant's staircase near the kitchens led to a small, seldom-used side door. The air outside was cool and damp, smelling of rain and wet earth. It felt like the first real breath she had taken in years. The moon was a sliver of silver in a cloudy sky, providing just enough light to see the gravel path that led away from the house, away from the manicured gardens and the oppressive, perfect symmetry of her prison. She did not look back. To look back was to risk turning into a pillar of salt, frozen by regret and what-ifs. She walked, her sturdy boots crunching on the gravel, until the grand, dark silhouette of Blackwood Manor was swallowed by the trees and the night. She was no one now. She had no title, no fortune, no name. She was just a woman, alone, with a secret life growing inside her, and for the first time since her wedding day, she felt utterly and completely free. The journey was a blur of jolting coaches and dusty, anonymous inns. Eleanor kept her head down, her face obscured by her cloak, speaking only when necessary. She bought a ticket for the longest route available, one that would take her to the farthest reaches of the country, to the wild, windswept coast of Cornwall. She had read of it in books, a place of rugged cliffs and independent people who cared little for the affairs of London society. It seemed like the edge of the world, a place where a duchess could disappear. She found a village called Port Carrick, a tiny cluster of granite cottages clinging to the side of a cliff, huddled around a small, protected harbor. The air tasted of salt and fish, and the constant cry of gulls replaced the oppressive silence of the manor. It was a harsh, beautiful, and utterly real place. It was here, she decided, that she would make her stand. Presenting herself as Mrs. Croft, a widow whose husband had been lost at sea, she sought lodging. Her story was thin, but the people of Port Carrick were not given to prying. They judged a person on their willingness to work, not on their past. She found a room to let above the local tavern, the Salty Siren, run by a formidable woman named Elspeth Gable. Mrs. Gable was a widow herself, with shrewd, kind eyes and hands that looked strong enough to haul an anchor. "You're no fisherman's widow," Mrs. Gable stated, her arms crossed over her broad chest as Eleanor stood before her, a pale, fine-boned creature in a plain but well-made dress. "Hands are too soft, but you've got a core of iron in you. I can see it in your eyes. You're running from something." Eleanor did not deny it. "I need a place to stay, and I need work. I can keep accounts, I can sew, I can clean." Mrs. Gable considered her for a long moment, her gaze taking in the subtle swell of Eleanor's belly. She nodded slowly. Room's 5 shillings a week. You can help me with the books and mending the nets for the lads. And when the time comes," she added, her voice softening slightly, "we'll see you through it." And so, the Duchess of Blackwood became Mrs. Croft, the quiet widow who kept the tavern's books. Her days were filled with the unfamiliar rhythms of hard, physical labor. She learned to scrub floors, to mend the coarse, rough netting until her fingers bled, to barter with fishermen for their catch. The soft, useless hands she had arrived with grew calloused and strong. The perpetual, low-grade ache in her back from her old life of inactivity was replaced by the honest exhaustion of a day's work. Months later, in the small, clean room above the noisy tavern, with Mrs. Gable and the local midwife by her side, she gave birth to a son. He was a beautiful, healthy baby with a tuft of dark hair and eyes the color of a stormy sea. She named him Thomas. As she held him in her arms for the first time, his tiny fingers curled around one of hers. The last vestiges of her old life fell away. She was not a duchess, not a wife, not a victim. She was a mother. It was the only title that mattered. 5 years passed, 5 years of salt spray and hard work, of raising a son on her own terms. Thomas grew into a bright, curious boy, sturdy and sure-footed from scrambling over the village's rocky shores. He had her quiet, observant nature, but he also had something that was pure Beaumont, a strong, determined set to his jaw, a distinctive, slightly cleft chin that was an exact echo of his father's. Sometimes, when she looked at him, a pang of the old life would strike her, a fleeting sorrow for what might have been. But then he would laugh, a clear, bright sound that filled her small world with joy, and the sorrow would vanish. They had little, but they had each other. They had a life that was real and their own, built not on lies and titles, but on love and resilience. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Blackwood Manor had become a tomb. After Eleanor's departure, a suffocating quiet had descended upon the house, far deeper and more chilling than the formal silence that had preceded it. Alistair found himself adrift in the vast, empty rooms. He had told himself her flight was an admission of guilt, a confirmation of the betrayal. He had allowed Frederick to spin a tale for society, a story of a fragile duchess whose nerves had given way, who had retired to a private sanatorium in the country. The lie was neat, tidy, and preserved the family name, but it did nothing to fill the echoing void in his life. Frederick's influence was now absolute. He was a constant presence at Alistair's side, advising, managing, controlling. He had everything he had ever wanted, short of the title itself. Yet the victory was hollow. The house was lifeless. The servants moved like specters, their faces carefully blank. Alistair would walk the long gallery, staring at the portraits of his ancestors, and for the first time he saw not strength, but a brittle, lonely pride. He saw himself reflected in their cold, unyielding eyes. The regret began as a whisper, a faint unease that pricked at the edges of his consciousness. He would find himself in her abandoned rooms, the scent of lavender and old books still clinging to the air. Her jewelry box sat on the dressing table, untouched. Her gowns hung in the armoire like the ghosts of a woman he had never truly known, a woman who had fled with nothing but the clothes on her back. Would a guilty woman, a scheming adulteress, leave behind a fortune? The whisper grew louder. He remembered the look in her eyes in his study that night. It was not the look of a liar caught in a deception. It was the look of a heart breaking. He remembered her quiet dignity, her intelligence, the way she would look at him sometimes, with a hope that he had been too blind and too arrogant to recognize. The catalyst for his doubt was a small, mundane thing. While reviewing the estate accounts, a task he had taken upon himself out of sheer, mind-numbing boredom, he came across a series of unusual payments made from his uncle's personal accounts, large sums paid out to a name he vaguely recognized, the stable boy Frederick had named as Eleanor's lover. The payments had continued for months after Eleanor had left. It was hush money, Alistair realized. But why continue to pay a man for his silence about a scandal that had already been contained? A cold seed of suspicion took root in the barren soil of his heart. It was a monstrous thought, a betrayal of the man who had been a father to him, but it would not be silenced. He began to look closer, to pull at the threads of the story Frederick had so carefully woven. He hired a discreet inquiry agent from London, a former Bow Street runner with a reputation for unearthing secrets the aristocracy preferred to keep buried. He gave the man a simple task: investigate Lord Frederick Beaumont, investigate the stable boy, investigate the origins of the letters. The agent's reports came weekly, delivered in plain, sealed envelopes. Each one was a chisel, chipping away at the granite edifice of Alistair's certainty. The stable boy, when found, was a drunkard who confessed, for a price, that he had never spoken more than 2 words to the Duchess, but had been paid handsomely by Lord Frederick to sign a prepared statement. The letters were examined by a handwriting expert, who declared them crude forgeries. The most damning report revealed Frederick's deep financial troubles, his gambling debts, his desperation. With Alistair childless and his wife disgraced, Frederick and his line stood to inherit everything. The truth, when it finally assembled itself in Alistair's mind, was a crushing weight. He had not been betrayed by Eleanor. He had been manipulated, played for a fool by the one man he had trusted implicitly. He had, through his own coldness, his own pride, his own unforgivable failure to trust his wife, driven her away. He had destroyed his own life, cast out the one person who might have truly loved him, and denied his own child. The realization did not come with anger, but with a profound, soul-deep sickness. The silence of the manor was no longer just an absence of sound. It was the sound of his own damnation. He had to find her. He had to know if she was safe. He had to atone for a sin so grievous he was not sure it could ever be forgiven. The agent's final report gave him a lead. A woman matching Eleanor's description, a widow named Mrs. Croft, had been traced to a remote fishing village in Cornwall. The journey to Portcarrick was a pilgrimage of penance. Alistair traveled not in his ducal carriage, but in a common hired coach, the discomfort of the journey a small, inadequate penance for the suffering he had caused. As the coach wound its way down the narrow, treacherous coastal road, the landscape changed. The lush, ordered countryside of his home gave way to a wild, untamed beauty. The air grew sharp with the scent of salt. He saw the village from a distance, a scattering of stone houses clinging to the rocks like barnacles, defiant against the vast, gray expanse of the sea. It was another world. He left the coach at the top of the village and walked down the steep, cobbled street. Fishermen mending their nets looked up as he passed, their faces weathered and unreadable. He felt their eyes on his fine, city-made clothes, marking him as an outsider. He saw the tavern, the Salty Siren, its sign creaking in the wind. And then he saw her. She was standing in a small yard behind the inn, hanging laundry on a line. The wind whipped strands of her dark hair across her face, and she impatiently pushed them away with the back of her hand. She was thinner than he remembered, and the simple faded dress she wore was nothing like the fine gowns he was used to seeing her in. But she was more beautiful than he had ever seen her. There was a strength in the set of her shoulders, a competence in her movements, a quiet resilience in her face that had been absent in the gilded cage of Blackwood Manor. A wave of shame so powerful it almost buckled his knees washed over him. This is what he had done. He had taken a duchess and forced her into this life of toil. He took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. Eleanor? Her name, spoken in his voice, sounded foreign in this place. She froze, her back to him, a wet sheet clutched in her hands. Slowly she turned. Her eyes, when they met his, were not filled with surprise or sorrow. They were filled with a cold, hard anger that was more devastating than any tears. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of any of the warmth it had once held for him. I I had to find you, he stammered, feeling clumsy and foolish. I know everything. About Frederick. The lies, the forgeries. I know. She gave a short, bitter laugh. You know? It has taken you 5 years to know? I knew the truth the moment the words left your lips in that study. What do you want, Your Grace? Have you come to drag me back to play the part of the dutiful wife? No, he said, shaking his head. No, I came to... I don't know what I came for. To tell you I'm sorry. To beg your forgiveness, though I know I have no right to it. Just then, the back door of the tavern burst open, and a small boy ran out, laughing as he chased a stray cat. Mama, Mrs. Gable says the stew is ready. The boy stopped short when he saw Alistair. He tilted his head, his expression one of open, childish curiosity. He had Eleanor's dark hair, but his eyes were a familiar stormy gray. And his chin, it was the Beaumont chin. Distinctive, strong, slightly cleft. It was like looking at a miniature of himself, at the portraits in the long gallery. The world seemed to stop turning. He could not breathe. This was his son, his living, breathing son, whom he had called a fraud and a bastard. Thomas, go inside, Eleanor said, her voice sharp, but the boy stood his ground, his gaze fixed on Alistair. Alistair slowly sank to one knee, his eyes never leaving the child's face. He saw 5 years of missed first steps, first words, first everything. The loss was a physical chasm that opened up inside him, vast and terrifying. Who are you? The boy asked, his voice clear and unafraid. Alistair opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was the Duke of Blackwood, a man of power and influence, and he was struck dumb by the simple question of a child he had abandoned. Eleanor stepped between them, her body a shield protecting her son from the man who had broken her heart. He is no one, she said, her voice trembling with a rage that had simmered for 5 long years. He is a ghost from a life we left behind. You will leave, Alistair. You will get back in your fine carriage, and you will go back to your cold, empty house, and you will leave us alone. You have done enough damage. He looked up at her, at the fierce, protective love in her eyes, a love he had thrown away. He saw the pain he had caused, etched into the lines around her mouth. He saw the strength she had forged in the fires he had set, and he knew she was right. He had no right to be here, no right to disrupt the life she had built. But he also knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could not leave. To leave now would be to abandon them all over again, a second, unforgivable sin. I am not leaving, he said, his voice quiet but firm as he rose to his feet. He looked not at her, but at the formidable woman, Mrs. Gable, who had appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression wary. Madam, I require a room. I will pay whatever you ask. Eleanor stared at him, aghast. You cannot stay here. I can, and I will, he replied, his gaze finally meeting hers. For the first time, she did not see a cold, arrogant duke. She saw a broken man. I will not force my presence on you, Eleanor, but I will not disappear again. I will stay in this village until I have proven to you the truth of my uncle's deceit. And I will stay until you tell me to go, knowing that I have done everything in my power to atone for what I have done. He would not be the Duke of Blackwood here. He would be a penitent. He would earn his place in their world, one painful, humbling step at a time. The atonement had begun. Alistair's first act of penance was to divest himself of the trappings of his rank. He sent a message with the returning coach, instructing his man of business in London to sell his traveling carriage and horses. His valet, who had been waiting with his luggage at the larger town nearby, was dismissed with a generous severance and sent back to Blackwood. Alistair was left with 2 trunks of clothes and a heavy purse, a man stripped of his ducal entourage, alone in a village that viewed him with suspicion. Mrs. Gable, after a long, silent conference with Eleanor, agreed to let him a room. It was small, tucked under the eaves, with a narrow bed and a single window that overlooked the restless sea. The rent she demanded was exorbitant, a punitive price he paid without haggling. It felt right. He deserved to pay. His days fell into a strange, new rhythm. He was determined to follow through on his promise to prove the truth. He sent for his inquiry agent, instructing him to bring the forger, a man named Harris, to Port Carrick. He also requested copies of Lord Frederick's bank ledgers and the stable boy's sworn recantation. He would not just tell Eleanor the truth. He would lay the cold, hard evidence at her feet. While he waited, he lived in a state of self-imposed exile within the tiny village. He did not approach Eleanor or Thomas directly, respecting the invisible wall she had erected between them. Instead, he watched. He watched her from a distance as she went about her day, her movements economical and strong. He saw the easy camaraderie she shared with the villagers, the respect she had earned. He saw her with Thomas, her love for him a fierce, gentle light. Every smile she gave her son was a knife in Alistair's gut, a reminder of the thousands of smiles he had missed. He saw the hardship of her life, the things a duke never noticed. He saw her hauling heavy buckets of water from the village well, the old pump handle broken and useless. He saw her rubbing her back in exhaustion after a long day. He saw Thomas staring wistfully at the intricate ship models in the window of the old sailmaker's shop, a luxury his mother could not afford. So he began to work. He was a duke, but he had received a gentleman's education, which included engineering and mechanics. He spent 2 full days taking apart the broken village pump, cleaning the rusted components, and using his own money to send for a replacement part from the nearest city. The villagers watched him, their skepticism slowly turning to grudging respect, as the man in the fine but increasingly salt-stained coat worked tirelessly, his hands becoming greasy and blistered. When he was finished, water gushed from the spout with an easy turn of the handle. He said nothing, simply wiped his hands and walked away. But he saw Eleanor watch him from the tavern window, her expression unreadable. In the evenings, in his small, cold room, he began to carve. He had been skilled at it as a boy, a forgotten hobby. He bought a block of wood and a good set of knives and began to work on a model of a naval frigate. He poured all his concentration, all his regret, all his unspoken love for the son he barely knew, into the intricate details of the tiny rigging, the perfectly formed cannons, the smooth lines of the hull. The inquiry agent arrived a fortnight later, a small, unassuming man who brought with him a nervous, sweating forger named Harris and a portfolio of documents. Alistair did not summon Eleanor. He waited until he saw her sitting alone on the low stone wall overlooking the harbor, a basket of mending forgotten at her side. He approached her slowly, holding the portfolio. He did not sit beside her, but stood a respectful distance away. "Eleanor, I have the proof I promised." She did not look at him. "I do not need your proof. It changes nothing." "It changes the truth of what you were accused of," he said gently. "It matters. Your name matters. Your honor matters." He opened the portfolio and laid the documents on the wall beside her. The stable boy's confession, the expert analysis of the forgeries, the bank ledgers showing the payments from Frederick. "The man who wrote the letters is in the village. He is willing to confess to you himself. I will not subject you to it unless you wish it." She looked down at the papers, her eyes scanning the damning evidence. He saw her hand tremble slightly as she picked up the forger's analysis. She was silent for a long time, the only sound the cry of the gulls and the rush of the tide against the rocks below. "Why?" she finally whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Why did you believe him so easily?" It was the question that had haunted him for months. He had no excuse, only a painful, shameful confession. "Because it was easier than looking at myself," he said, his own voice raw with self-loathing. "Our marriage was cold, empty, and that was my fault. I was a poor husband. I was distant, arrogant, and I neglected you. It was easier to believe you had sought comfort elsewhere than to admit I had given you no comfort to seek. It was the coward's way out, Eleanor. And I was a coward." She finally looked up at him then, and he saw not just anger in her eyes, but a deep, aching sorrow. For the first time, a crack appeared in the wall between them. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. The final act of the drama began with the unexpected arrival of Lord Frederick Beaumont. Driven by a growing panic that Alistair's prolonged absence meant his carefully constructed world was about to collapse, he had followed him to Cornwall. He arrived in a grand carriage that looked utterly obscene in the humble village, his face a mask of rage and fear. He found Alistair on the quay, speaking with a fisherman. "What is the meaning of this, Alistair? Hiding away in this hovel? Society is asking questions. You are making a fool of yourself." "On the contrary, uncle," Alistair said, his voice calm and cold as the sea. "I am, for the first time in my life, doing something that is not foolish. We will finish this discussion tonight, at dinner, at the inn." Alistair arranged it all. He asked Mrs. Gable to prepare a private dining room. He requested that Eleanor and Thomas join them. Eleanor was hesitant, afraid, but Alistair's quiet insistence and a dawning realization that this had to be faced finally convinced her. The four of them sat at a small table. The air was thick with tension. Frederick stared at Thomas, who sat quietly beside his mother, with open revulsion. Alistair was a figure of granite, his face set, his resolve absolute. "So, this is the reason for your ridiculous charade," Frederick sneered, gesturing at Thomas with his wineglass. "You have found the woman and her issue. Alistair, can you not see? The child is a fraud, a common bastard she is trying to pass off as yours to reclaim her position." The words, so similar to the ones that had destroyed their lives 5 years ago, hung in the air. But this time, something was different. This time, Alistair did not waver. Before he could speak, however, a small, clear voice cut through the tension. It was Thomas. He had been listening intently, his brow furrowed. He had seen the locket his mother sometimes looked at, the one that held a tiny painting of the stern-looking man who was his father. He had seen the portraits in the books about great houses she read to him. He looked from Frederick's face to Alistair's, his gaze settling on their chins. He pointed a small finger at his own chin. "Mama says I have the family chin." Then he looked directly at Frederick, his expression one of pure, unadulterated childish logic. "If I am a fraud," he asked, "why do you and my father and all the men in the portraits have my chin?" The question was a cannonball, delivered by a child, that shattered Frederick's composure completely. The simple, irrefutable genetic truth, spoken with such innocence, exposed his lie for the pathetic, desperate thing it was. The color drained from Frederick's face. Mrs. Gable, who had been standing silently by the door, let out a small, satisfied gasp. Alistair leaned forward, his voice low and lethal. "It is over, Frederick. I have the forger's confession. I have your bank records. I have everything. You will leave this place tonight. You will sign a full confession of your actions, and you will retire to the most remote, miserable corner of the continent you can find. If I ever see your face or hear your name again, I will have you prosecuted for treason against the House of Blackwood. You are disowned. You are nothing." Frederick stared at him, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. He was ruined, utterly and completely, not by a duke's power or a lawyer's argument, but by the simple, honest observation of the child he had tried to erase. He stumbled to his feet and fled the room, a broken, defeated man. In the silence that followed, Thomas looked at Alistair, a flicker of understanding in his young eyes. "You are my father," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement. Alistair felt the last of his own defenses crumble. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading hope. The anger had gone from her face, replaced by a profound, weary sadness. The battle was over. The enemy was vanquished. But the ruins of their life remained, and she did not yet know if anything could be rebuilt. Later that night, long after Thomas was asleep, Alistair found Eleanor by the fire in the tavern's quiet common room. The storm outside had passed, and the only sounds were the crackle of the flames and the distant sigh of the sea. He did not speak, but simply stood by the mantel, his heart too full for words. It was she who broke the silence. "All this time," she said, her voice soft, "I hated you. I nursed that hatred. I kept it warm. It was my shield. It was what kept me going. And now, I'm just tired." He finally moved, sinking into the chair opposite her. He looked smaller in the firelight, stripped of his ducal arrogance, his face etched with exhaustion and regret. "I deserve your hatred, Eleanor. I deserve your contempt. I do not deserve your forgiveness." He leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees, his gaze fixed on the floor. "When I realized what I had done, what I had lost, the emptiness of my life was absolute. I had the title, the wealth, the power, and I was the poorest man on earth, because I had thrown away the only thing that had ever truly been precious." He finally looked up, and she was shocked to see the glint of tears in his eyes. "I failed you. I failed our son. I failed myself. I was not a man. I was a title, an empty suit of armor. You and Thomas, you are the first real things in my life, and I have no right to ask for a place in yours." He did not ask. He did not demand. He simply laid his broken, humbled heart before her, a confession of his own profound failure. Seeing him like this, stripped bare of all his defenses, a man drowning in his own regret, Eleanor felt the hard shield of her hatred finally dissolve. It did not evaporate into a sudden rush of love, but into a deep, compassionate sorrow for them both, for the years they had lost, for the pain they had both endured. She thought of the past few weeks, of the man who had fixed the village pump, who had carved a ship for a boy he was not allowed to claim, who had faced down his own family to bring her the truth. He had not used his power or his wealth to command her. He had used his hands, his time, his humility. He had shown her, through his actions, that he was no longer the same man who had sent her away. "Alistair," she said, his name feeling strange and yet right on her tongue. "I do not know if I can forgive you. Not yet. Forgiveness is a mountain to climb, but I am tired of living in the valley of hatred." She took a deep breath. Perhaps we can try to find a path up that mountain, together." It was not a declaration of love. It was not a promise of a happy ending. It was a fragile, tentative offer of hope. For Alistair, it was more than he had dared to pray for. It was everything. Their return to Blackwood Manor was not a triumphant procession. They traveled quietly, a small family unit feeling their way back into a world that no longer seemed to fit. The manor, when they arrived, felt different. To Alistair, it was no longer a symbol of his power, but a monument to his failure. To Eleanor, it was a place of ghosts, but she was no longer one of them. She walked through the grand entrance hall not as a decorative duchess, but as a survivor, a mother, a woman who knew her own strength. Life did not magically revert to how it was, nor did they want it to. The changes were slow, deliberate, and profound. Alistair formally acknowledged Thomas as his son and heir, but they protected the boy from the prying eyes and vicious gossip of society. Their world shrank, becoming focused on the three of them, on the quiet, patient work of rebuilding a family from its broken foundations. Eleanor did not resume her old life of silent observation. Having known hardship, having managed the accounts of a tavern and bargained with fishermen, she found she had a keen mind for the practicalities of the estate. She began to review the tenant records, not as lists of names, but as families. She saw the damp cottages Lord Frederick had dismissed, the widows struggling to make ends meet, the children who lacked a proper school. She went to Alastair, not with a tentative suggestion, but with a detailed plan. "We will use the income from the London properties to build a new schoolhouse," she declared, spreading maps and ledgers across his desk. "And we will drain the West Riding fields properly and repair the tenants' roofs before winter. It is our duty." The old Alastair would have deferred to his man of business. The new Alastair looked at his wife with admiration and love. "It is an excellent plan," he said. "We will begin tomorrow." He did not say I, he said we. They were partners now, in every sense of the word. The management of the dukedom became a shared responsibility, his knowledge of policy and finance blending with her compassion and practical insight. Blackwood began to thrive, not just financially, but as a community. Their personal reconciliation was a quieter, more delicate process. It happened in small moments, Alastair watching Eleanor teach Thomas to read by the fire, his heart aching with a gentle, profound love. Eleanor finding Alastair in the gardens, his hands dirty from helping the groundskeepers, a quiet contentment on his face she had never seen before. It happened one evening when Thomas, sick with a fever, would only be comforted by his father, and Alastair sat by his bed all night, holding his small hand, Eleanor watching from the doorway as the man she was learning to love again became the father their son had always deserved. One cool autumn afternoon, months after their return, Eleanor was walking in the woods where, according to Frederick's lie, she had met her phantom lover. The memory held no sting now. Alastair found her there, standing in a patch of sunlight filtering through the golden leaves. He did not speak, but simply held out his hand. She took it. His hand was no longer the soft hand of an idle aristocrat. It bore the calluses of the work he had done on the pump, the small nicks from his carving knife. It was the hand of a man who had changed. "I love you, Eleanor," he said, his voice quiet and certain. "I believe I loved you even then, in my own foolish, blind way. I just did not know how to show it. I did not know how to be a husband. I am still learning." "I am learning too," she confessed, her fingers tightening around his. "I am learning how to trust again. I am learning that the man I married is not the man who stands before me now." She smiled, a true, warm smile that reached her eyes. "And I find that I am very much in love with the man who stands before me now." The story did not end with a grand ball or a public declaration. It ended on a quiet winter evening. A fire crackled in the hearth of the family drawing room, the same room that had once felt so formal and oppressive. Alastair was on the floor, on his hands and knees, letting Thomas sail the beautifully carved frigate across the vast ocean of the Aubusson carpet. The sound of his son's delighted laughter filled the silence that had once haunted these walls. Eleanor sat in a comfortable chair, a book open in her lap, though she was not reading. She was watching her husband and her son. She looked around the room, at the warm firelight dancing on the walls, at the man who had journeyed through hell to find his own heart, at the child who was the living proof of their story. The house was no longer a gilded cage or a mausoleum. It was a home, and its foundations, once built on duty and pride, were now rebuilt with something far stronger: truth, atonement, and a love that had been lost, and then, miraculously, earned.